Hello, everyone. My project for this week is on J. Gresham Machen, the fundamentalist, liberal, and modernist controversy and the reorganization of Princeton Theological Seminary. The roots of the conflict came in the 19th century. As we've learned previously in the course, the ousting of Charles A. Briggs, Henry Preserved Smith, and Arthur C. McGriffert kind of laid the foundation for eventually what happened with the seminary. In 1910, several years later, the conflict picked up again when the Presbyterian General Assembly adopted what they called the 5 essential and necessary doctrines, quite fitting for Calvinists to adopt 5 of them, that were a distillation of the Westminster Confession. They included inerrancy, the virgin birth, the atonement as vicarious sacrifice, maybe you know that as penal substitution, the bodily resurrection of Christ, and the authenticity of Jesus' miracles. So you can see those aren't maybe the traditional core doctrines that we think of when we think of Christianity in terms of like justification by faith and that sort of thing. But the New York Presbytery in particular continued to resist and continue to harbor resentment about Buck. As we have seen elsewhere, on the liberal side of things, with pro-Buck is where we saw this, the transition was not as much about doctrines per se for liberals, though that was definitely there, but of what Christianity was supposed to be. And for them, it was a social movement. So that was a really important kind of forming narrative for them. In the 20th century, the General Assembly also became a little more enamored with reconciliation with Southern Presbyterians. They had split due to the Civil War. The proposed solution that they put on the table was to give a council control of church ministries, both south and north, but to allow each group's polity and doctrine to remain within their presbytery, i.e. within their local churches. The idea was soundly rejected by both sides, but it did provide the foundation for what came later with Princeton. In 1918, about 8 years later, the conflict once again kind of gained steam. It had been an undercurrent the whole time, but it really gained steam in 1918. First Presbyterian Church in New York City, part of the New York district of the Presbytery, brought in Harry Emerson Fosdick. And his first sermon that he preached was, of course, a sermon that we're all familiar with, Shall the Fundamentalists Win? In which he really challenged and pushed back on that conservative fundamentalist view. For his part, Machen published a book called Christianity and Liberalism, which again we are also familiar with. But this was not a direct response to Fosdick. It came about 5 years later. He probably had a little bit of what Fosdick had to say in mind, but he really represented the conservative position. And his argument was, well, if you're going to throw out these distinctives of Christianity, then you don't have Christianity anymore, because that's just not what it is. It is all of these things. And he noted, a creed is not a mere expression of Christian experience, but is the setting forth of what the Christian experience is based on, right? So it is not just that we express what we believe, it is what we experience as believers is based on, right? So if there's no resurrection, 1 Corinthians 15, then there's no faith. And for Machen, he really argued liberalism was a slippery slope to unbelief and no compromise was possible for him. Machen therefore believed the hour for separation in the church was drawing near. But it wasn't just confined to the church. This was also starting to rope in the seminaries. But as they continued, pressure mounted on conservatives, prompting Machen on June 21st, 1925, to write in the New York Times that despite the term fundamentalist was meant pejoratively and seemed to suggest that they were some type of strange sect. And really all that they were doing was maintaining the historic Christian doctrines. And if that was what made them fundamentalists, well, in Machen's mind, no, that's what made them Christian. And as I noted, it was impossible that this was to keep this out of the seminary. It was going to come in. Meanwhile, at Princeton, the professors were very sharply divided. Some would not even listen to Machen preach. He was brought in to be a temporary pastor at First Presbyterian Church in Princeton. They wouldn't even show up. They even gave up their pews. That later changed when they brought in another preacher and they all returned. But while the infighting was going on at the seminary, some churches, individual presbyteries, began to push back on these essential doctrines that were adopted by the General Assembly. More than 1,000 ministers, formally, both conservatives and liberals, formally opposed the General Assembly's doctrines. They argued that the Constitution said that any formal doctrinal adoptions required the concurrent action of the Assembly and the presbyteries. So their argument was that they had overstepped their governing authority, something we hear a lot about these days for some reason. But by 1926, many in the Assembly and at the seminary had began to argue that differing doctrinal perspectives should be tolerated within the school and within the Assembly. The church's institutions, they argued, and ministries were as much a part of Presbyterian community and identity as doctrine. So you didn't even need doctrine to have these institutions. They could exist separately, they couldn't be done away with. They were just as important as doctrine. That, of course, included Princeton, and put even more pressure on the seminary. Machen's conservative group of professors at the seminary were in the majority and had the board of directors support, which sounds really great. The liberal contingent was a powerful minority, though, and had the support of the trustees, a group that had equal power to the board of governors. So you can see you have a stalemate here, and nobody seems willing to give. To try and resolve the impasse, the General Assembly appointed a committee to look into divisions at the seminary, and around the same time it began to equivocate on its essential and necessary doctrines. The new call was for tolerance, and Machen was not having that. Meanwhile, as the committees did its work, Machen attended a conference in Baltimore, and during the conference a general sent was put up for the different leaders from the churches to support the Volstead Act 18th Amendment prohibition. Machen, as you know, didn't support that, so he declined, but then his liberal opponents took his refusal to do so and then began a smear campaign against him, accusing him of being wet and an alcoholic and all of these other sort of things. And they continued to hit that political cudgel again and again and again to drive Machen's reputation down. Kind of in response to a lot of these, the AP did a story on the ongoings at Princeton, and in the Evening Star, Machen was quoted as saying that conservatives ought to be allowed to have at least one seminary that clearly and unequivocally represents their views, kind of foreshadowing what his next move would be. The infighting, of course, went on, and neither side was willing to give. In 1929, the General Assembly moved in after the committee had been dissolved and merged the trustees and directors into one group, and then added a third component that was somewhat seen as accommodating to conservatives, but they were moderate conservatives. That group invited all of the faculty to return, but it was clear that the moderate conservatives had adjusted the status of the leadership of the school to the left. And so there was going to be tolerance for all of the different views that were going to be represented in the school. Machen, of course, that was not something that was conscionable to him. So Machen, Robert Dick Wilson, and Oswald Allis all refused to come back to the school. This group became the nucleus of Westminster Theological Seminary, and they even brought with them a gentleman whose books you may have read or seen, also Cornelius Van Til, who demurred his brand new appointment at Princeton in order to join Westminster. Thank you.